things get going at 3 o'clock. All right. But in the meantime, does everyone just say hi? Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Howdy.
I'm really appreciative of you guys taking the time to do this every year. I think this is some of the most important science communication we can have to have people understand what's happening with the climate, what's actively being happened to work on it, and how others can get involved. So it's great to see such a illustrious panel coming together. Okay.
Should be a good chat today.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys caught any of the other festival events. We just finished up the cultural cooking workshop. We were making margaritas and other pretty good food. So if you ever get a chance to host a cooking workshop, I strongly recommend it because you get leftovers. It's great.
That is excellent.
Yeah, the prickly pear margarita was terrific. It was good. And my wife devoured some of the squash dish that was put together. And so I have some stuff tomorrow for other fun things. Okay. Did anyone get a chance to watch the keynote address from Friday?
I'm sad to miss it.
It is available still on YouTube. Yeah, anyone can watch it. Sherry was our hostess with the mostest, and she did we had some technical difficulties that she sorted through that comes when you have an engineer who does not do streaming for a living, trying to figure it out.
It all worked out in the end. It
did. Okay, so it's 3 o'clock. Let's kick things off. Lots of noise in my household. First off, thank you for attending the climate change panel discussion. My name is Brandon Lurie, and I'm a Flagstaff Festival of Science board member. Joining me is Sherry Schaefer, also a board member. Prior to beginning, I'd like you to know that the festival is live streaming this webinar to YouTube. Only the hosts and panelists will be visible or heard during the simulcast. This event is part of the Flagstaff Festival of Science, which we like to hail as the 10 best days of the year. Our mission is to connect and inspire the citizens of Northern Arizona, particularly the youth, with the wonders of science and the joy of scientific discovery. Your participation and support are vital to our shared success. All festival events are free, thanks to our generous sponsors and donors. If you'd like to support our work, please go to scifest.org and click donate. This is only one of nearly 100 events during the festival. You can find a full list at scifest.org. Some events are pre-ordered tickets. All of our webinars, events, you have the ability to pre-register. The festival's Eventbrite page is something new this year. flgscifest.eventbrite.com has all of our webinar registration links and many of the tickets for events that require a reservation. On the festival's webpage, in addition to finding a listing of events, there's a link to the festival's YouTube page where you can find recorded versions of the webinars and talks from this year's festival and previous festivals. Links to the festival's website and Eventbrite page can be found in the chat, which will drop down. Looks like Sherry's already put in there. The upcoming events, or I'll just share one upcoming event I'm excited about because we want to get going with the panel discussion. On this Friday are Sci Talks. They are an in-person event and opening yourself for the arts. If you would like to go, the first talk is at 6:30. Go to Sci Talks, SCI Talks 2021.eventbrite.com. We'll put that in the chat as well. 4 talks, lots of fun. And lastly, before I hand over, just a little bit of housekeeping. First, one way to really support the festival is to fill out a survey on how we're doing so we can understand how to improve future festivals. If you do so, you'll get a set of one person will get a set of AirPods. There is the survey, a link is in the chat. Secondly, if you are having technical difficulties, please put your question in the chat. If you have a question for a presenter, using the Q&A box. You'll be able to upvote questions that you like. The questions that are upvoted are more likely to be asked. Okay. Thank you for being very patient. I'd like to hand this over to Sean, who will get things kicked off for the panel discussion. I've been looking forward to this all year. So I want to say thank you, Sean, and take it away.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just introduce myself to everybody. I'm Sean Newell. My day job, I work with NGOs and community-based groups to help build organizational capacity. And most of them are working on water development and sustainable agriculture on Western Navajo. And in my other life, which is right now, I'm also the co-lead of the Flagstaff chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. And so on behalf of all of us participating on the panel, our thanks to Festival of Science for providing the space for an annual update of the state of the climate, and also allowing us to enter the space where science meets society, because I think that's where a lot of key decisions are made. So I'd like to thank each member of this panel for taking time out of your extremely busy lives to come together on a precious day off to tackle a really challenging topic. And I thank everybody who's here for coming today. And it's going to be your questions that guide the panel discussion. So please do use that Q&A box to let us know what you want to talk about. So here's how this will work. Each panelist will present briefly. They're going to go all in a row. You can ask questions as we go in the Q&A box, but we won't stop and answer them until the last presenter is finished. So we'll leave about a half hour for discussion and then close about 4:30. So first, I'd like to introduce possibly the most important person here, Jillian Goulet, who's the Climate Engagement Coordinator at City of Flagstaff and a Climate Science and Solutions grad student. She's working behind the scenes to curate the questions for the Q&A. So thank you, Jillian, for doing that. And our panel, I'll just go down in no particular order. Eric Nielsen joins us as an Associate Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at NAU. Currently, he serves as NAU's Environmental Caucus Chair as they work with the NAU Sustainability Office to draft our next ambitious climate action plan from NAU. Yay. Jenny Neiman, Climate Program Manager for the City of Flagstaff Sustainability Section. Jenny works on implementing the city's new carbon neutrality plan and moving climate action and climate equity forward within both the city organization and the community. Karen Wadsack joins us. She's a program manager at National Renewable Energy Lab, working to advance power system decarbonization, integration, and resilience around the globe. So you'll learn more about what all that means. She previously worked more than a decade directing renewable energy research projects at NAU. Josh Rubik is the group co-leader, works with me, Citizens Climate Lobby Flagstaff. He has an undergraduate degree in environmental engineering from NAU and manages the Hazardous Waste Products Center for the City of Flagstaff. John Figveresi is an assistant professor of practice within the School of Earth and Sustainability, as well as director of Climate Science and Solutions Program at NAU. His research background is glaciology and climate science with a focus on the analysis and interpretation of Antarctic ice cores and polar ice sheets. So he gets to go to everywhere on the top, top and bottom. So John's going to start us off and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and thank you everybody for tuning in. Right, let's wait for the slides to come up here. So I was asked to kick us off by just giving a little background on the science and sort of where we're at and what things might look like here in town, locally in Flagstaff and both in Arizona. So yeah, let's start off with slide 1 here. Right, so if you've been paying attention to the news at all recently, you may have heard that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, just put out a brand new assessment report. And what's really important about this report is it's the first time that they've put out a report where we've used very, very strong language in all of the chapters. So you'll see things in this report like unequivocal, virtually certain, indisputable, irreversible. So this is really the first time where, as a community, all of the scientists have come together and said, there's really no debate anymore. We are absolutely certain all of these things are happening. So next slide. Right, so a few things to note. It's been remarkably warm. 8 of the 10 hottest years on record in the US have been in the last 25 years. And even more specifically, the 5 hottest years on instrumental record have been in the past 9. So it's been really hot. Next slide. So the IPCC and also the Paris Climate Accords, remember those, they both noted in their documents that we need, as a planet, we need to stay under about 1.5 degrees C of warming. So that's a little bit under 3 degrees Fahrenheit in order for our planet to stay comfortably livable into the future. But we're failing at this, unfortunately. And on our current trajectory, we will surpass that amount of warming in as little as 10 to 15 years. So we're on a pretty dangerous path. Next slide. Again, I just want to stress that one of the things that come out of this new report is that there really is no debate on the science anymore. I mean, we knew about greenhouse gases and climate change decades ago, but this is really the first time where, as a global community, we are absolutely pounding on the table that we are certain about things. As a part of this report, the scientists looked at over 14,000 different publications, over 234 authors from 65 countries around the world, and they all looked at 78,000 public comments related to the report in order to put this report out. So there was a lot of peer review and a lot of global collaboration on this report. And that's why now we're able to say things in this report like recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and unprecedented in thousands of years. Next slide. Okay, so I don't want to show a whole bunch of plots because I know plots can be a bit confounding, but it's really important to know that when you do pull out data and you want to look at how we actually know and we can say with confidence that these things are happening, it's important to know that no matter where you pull your data from, it all says the same story. It all tells the same story. So when you look at instrumental data going back to the 1880s through today, whether you're looking at satellite data or weather station data or various other instrumental data, they all show the same trends that we have warmed in the last 100 years by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's continuing. Next slide. The other thing to know is that we know it's not just natural cycles. There are definitely things that change naturally, or Earth's orbit, sunspots, volcanoes, all sorts of things that happen naturally in the Earth's dynamic systems. But we know that's not what's causing it. If we look at all of the natural forcings and we put those into models, it matches what we see thousands of years ago, but as soon as you get up to the industrial era, it no longer matches what we see. So we know that there's something else going on and it can't be explained by natural processes. Next slide. So when we also factor in all of the things that we're doing, most notably burning fossil fuels, and we plug into those same models and we push it forward, we see that it actually matches exactly. So this is how we know, yes, there are some things naturally that are causing the climate to wiggle a little bit here and there, but the primary forcer is us. It's us burning fossil fuels. Next slide. And if we look at various models, there are tools that you can look at on different websites where you can actually project what you expect to see in various parts of the world. And just to give you an example, this is a tool called the Climate Explorer. If you plug in Flagstaff as the starting point, there's some very troubling trends. By 2100, so just in 80 years from now, the average temperature year-round in Flagstaff is predicted to be about 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. So obviously that means really hot summers, but it also means really warm winters as well. So you think about all the snow we get on the mountains and sort of what the winters are like here, and you add 10 degrees to that, it's a very different story. Next slide. So really briefly, without getting too much into the physics, what's causing all this? The very, very simple answer is greenhouse gases. And we know this, we've known this for over 100 years. Carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, they're all greenhouse gases. Without them, the Earth's climate would be 15 to 20 degrees colder. And you look at other planets like Venus that have insane amounts of greenhouse gases, and they're really, really hot. So we know this. We know that this is a basic physics and thermodynamics processes. You put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it warms the atmosphere. Today, we're sitting at 412 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. That means for every million molecules of air, 412 of those are carbon dioxide, which doesn't sound like a lot, 0.4%. But it has a very strong effect. So it's actually a really, really large amount, and it's a larger amount than we've seen in the atmosphere for several thousands of years. It hasn't actually been, the concentrations haven't been as high as they are now since a time in the geologic past called the Pliocene. So it's been a really long time since we've had this much CO2 in the atmosphere. Next slide. And lastly, we've known this, like I said, for 150 years. Scientists back in the 1800s did experiments, and they figured out, hey, there are certain gases that are really good at trapping energy and then re-emitting that energy. And so carbon dioxide is really good at absorbing infrared or heat and then re-emitting it. And it re-emits it in all sorts of different directions, but fundamentally, some of that gets re-emitted back down to the surface of the Earth, thereby trapping it in the atmosphere. So the more CO2 you have in the air, the more of that infrared heat radiation gets re-emitted back down to the surface and thereby trapping it, sort of getting caught in this cycle. So you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more infrared you're going to trap. Next slide. And so lastly, where we head into the future is really going to depend on how we act. And this is one of the big takeaways from all of these new reports is there's different ways we can go. There's different emission scenarios. There's sort of different futures that we can map out. And it really comes down to the choices we make. So whether or not we set very aggressive emissions goals or we kind of stay on more of a business as usual path really is going to depend, really is going to change sort of where we head into the future. And an important thing I will note here on this last slide too is that this is not linear. So what I mean by that is for every degree that we warm, it doesn't equal a single unit of impacts or damages. It's actually nonlinear. So for every degree we warm, the damages get exponentially worse. So we really want to try and keep those damages or that warming to a minimum. So, all right, next slide. So I'm actually taking over here on the second part. I'm going to keep going for another few minutes and talk a little bit more about what's going on locally. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, this all sounds really bad. You start thinking about sea level rise and all these things. You're like, yeah, but I'm in Arizona. So what is that really going to look like? And why does it really matter here in Arizona and even more specifically in Flagstaff? So next slide. Right. So again, I'm just going to pull some of these quotes out of the report. We can say things like climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. So this is not just one or two little things happening here or there. Everywhere around the planet, we're seeing impacts of climate change. And the changes will increase with further warming. Just like I said, it's not linear. So the more warming we get, the more the higher the magnitude of those damages and those impacts. So next slide. And the one quote that I pulled out that I thought was a little bit sobering was this one, and that there's no going back from some of the changes that we're seeing. And what that simply is saying is that there's so much inertia in a lot of these systems that some of the changes we've already committed to, even if we could turn off all of the smokestacks tomorrow and turn off all emissions tomorrow, there is already certain level of impacts and damages that we've committed to that are going to happen regardless. There's a certain amount of sea level rise that's going to happen, a certain amount of polar ice sheets that are going to melt simply because there's so much energy in the system already. So that's just something to think about is, we can't wait till the last minute to fix these problems because we're already committed to a whole series of damages. Next slide. This is just a fun anecdote I like to show you to put it in context. This is the complete opposite side of the world. So we're talking all the way down on the southern island of New Zealand. I went to visit a very famous glacier in 2008, and the glacier came all the way down the valley, and I could stand at the gate and say, hey, look at that. I can almost touch the end of the glacier. I went back just 6 years later, and the entire glacier has melted and retreated all the way up the valley. So that's just one anecdotal example, but it just gives you an idea of, some things like this is happening all around the world. And just because we're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not happening. So next slide. Right, so some more things from the report, just some things that we can start expecting and that are going to be happening in greater extremes and greater numbers. Obviously more extreme heat, more frequent and also more intense. A lot of changes to precipitation, a lot more rainfall in some areas, a lot less rainfall in others. Obviously increased drought in a lot of places, including here. A lot of changes to what it's often referred to as fire weather, but really just sort of think of wildfires. A lot more frequent, which is clearly happening here in Flagstaff and in Arizona in general, in California and sort of in the West in general. And then a lot of changes to the ocean chemistry, acidification and warming in general. Next slide. This is a very complicated figure, but I just want to, what I'm trying to show in this is these little hexagons are meant to represent different parts of the world. So you can kind of see North America, South America, then, Asia and Africa. But you should just notice that everything is red. Everything is red. And all that's saying is in every region of the world, temperature extremes are predicted to go up. There is nowhere in the world where it's going to get essentially cooler. So that's a really important takeaway, is that really doesn't matter where you go. The hot extremes are going to increase. Next slide. And then this one is just a very similar figure, but it's meant to show drought. And so obviously this is not, droughts aren't going to be as widespread, but I showed this picture because if you look on the far left side, you see Western North America, the WNA is colored, and that represents our region. So we are definitely one of the regions that's picked out as having a high confidence that we are going to have increased drought and issues with agriculture, essentially. So, right. Another thing, if you want to think of this from an economic perspective, the impacts are going to be varied. So it's going to be, again, all these sea level rise, wildfire, droughts, all of these different sectors, but altogether, economically, it's going to cost billions and trillions of dollars to deal with these hazards and these impacts. So that's just something to think about, is even if you want to remove yourself from the, from even just the science of it and think about it as strictly as a solutions and an economic problem, this is going to be a real major hit to our GDP, and just globally, it's going to be a massive economic impact. So next slide. And not to dwell on this too much, but this is the reason I wanted to show this, is just so you could get a sense of the size of the little circles here. There's going to be a large amount of cost associated with extreme temperature mortality, a large amount of costs associated with labor, lost labor, and coastal property damages and things like that. But then all of these other little circles too, roads, infrastructure, air quality, all these different sectors are going to be impacted. I mean, you can read through that list: coral reefs, bridges, shellfish, agriculture, urban drainings, rail. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Next slide. So here in the Southwest, the important ones are going to be extreme temperature and labor. That's where we're going to see our biggest economic impacts. The Southwest is projected to experience high levels of premature mortality associated with extreme temperatures. You think about people around Flagstaff who don't have air conditioning, and if we really do warm up 10 degrees, that's going to be a major change. The Southwest is also projected to be one of the regions with the largest lost welfare associated with municipal and industrial water supply. So obviously water is a big issue in Arizona as well. So yep, just 2 more slides, I think. Go on, one more, or next slide. Southwest, just again, we're in a huge drought and it's continuing. A lot of wildfires and debris flows. Next slide. And obviously our reservoirs are at an all-time low. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are both at record lows right now, and we're about to institute a water emergency declaration with California, Nevada. So that's also a big impact. Next slide. This is the last one. And then just some things that you can think about, and we'll transition over here, that you're going to have to think about here locally in Flagstaff: less snowpack, more wildfires, more drought, hotter temperature, and also more diseases and vectors coming in from insect-borne vectors. So I think that was the last slide. Maybe one more? You can skip ahead if you want, but the climate, yeah, we experience the future depends on the decisions we make now. So that's really the big takeaway. All right. Yes, that was it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to turn it over to Eric now.
Thank you, John. Can you all hear me? All right. I'd like to switch a little bit from some of the physical science to really thinking about our economy and the structure of our economy and where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, to sort of lay out the challenge that we face here in the United States and countries around the world face as well. Next. So we think about the composition of our economy, the burning of fossil fuel primarily in our energy system as the major sources. carbon dioxide and methane, primarily associated with energy, but methane also associated with agriculture. And the pie chart on the right lays out sort of the distribution across sectors. And one of the key take homes from just looking at the basic structure is that of our economy, is that transportation is now the greatest source of US greenhouse gas emissions. And the fact that fundamentally we're talking about every single sector in our economy that needs to be transformed. Next, please. And the United States emissions profile, if you look at the figure, we have our net emissions, which is the blue line, the total emissions, which are our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions in the green, that we peaked around 2007, 2008. And interestingly, we had a recession right after that, but we also had an administration that attempted to take mitigation and reduction in greenhouse gases very seriously as a form of national policy. But at the same time, we also had the emergence and really explosion of this thing called fracking for natural gas. And that helps to explain a big part of our reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. But if you look at that trend line downward, it's not fast enough to the targets that the international community has set for emissions reductions. Next. And it's pretty clear when I just mentioned about the increase in fracking and our use of natural gas in the power sector, that where we've seen real reductions in greenhouse gas emissions since the 2007, 2008 has been in the power sector and the substitution of natural gas for coal. Part of that's policy, part of that's economics. And Karin will talk a little bit more about the emergence also of alternative low carbon or zero carbon emitting power sources. But in our other sectors, we have not seen as much progress. If you look at the far right end of the red, you'll see that transportation dipped quite significantly in 2020 due to COVID. And that level of decrease is basically about 13% of US emissions. And if we want to hit some of these international targets for the Paris climate commitments, we need to do that same reduction every year. So when you think about how many cars and how much emissions were taken off the road, that's what we have to do every year for the next 20 years to be able to hit these emissions targets. Next slide.
All right, folks, I'm just going to jump in here real fast and talk about the City of Flagstaff's, or the Flagstaff community rather's emissions. And this is similar. The graphs look different, but it's pretty similar to Eric. And all I really want to say is Flagstaff has the same essentially emissions profile as the rest of the US. Our emissions come from building energy, from transportation, and from waste. So that's natural gas, propane, and electricity we use in our homes, as well as water use. We have really energy intensive water. It's our resident travel, visitor travel via really gas and diesel purchased at our gas stations, as well as a little bit from transit operations. And then it's emissions from the landfill. So remember everything Eric said, and really Flagstaff looks really similarly, even though these graphs look pretty different. All right, I think we're going over to Karin.
Great, thanks, Jenny. You can go ahead to the next slide. And I'm going to just make 3 key points here, and we can come back and talk about any of these in a lot more detail in the Q&A. The first point I wanted to make is that the electrical system has to be balanced. And this is something that a lot of people are not necessarily familiar with, but the supply are all of the power plants that make electricity, and the demand, so all of us using electricity, have to be in perfect balance at all times within the system in order for the lights to stay on. And what that means is that the sum of all the different kinds of electricity generation at any given time has to be able to meet the electricity usage or load. So for example, if we have a huge amount of solar on the system, we need a lot less of other things. And this can be operationally challenging because not all power plants can ramp up and down to change and meet that changes in demand at will. This is important to understand when we're thinking about both the technology and the policy solutions for decarbonizing or reducing the emissions of the electrical system. But it also creates opportunities for things like demand response, which is moving your electricity usage around to either conserve energy or make money, or things like smart EV charging, which can enable us to integrate more renewable energy, so decarbonized electricity onto the grid. On the map here, the blue, green, and tannish are 3 electrically distinct areas. And then all those circles are little areas that have to balance. And if everybody balances their own area, we're all electrically holding hands, so the whole system works. And that is something that enables us to find better ways to balance both within and between these areas as we're bringing on more renewables to decarbonize and reduce other pollution. Next slide. We have some renewables on the system, but we need to bring on an awful lot more renewables or other carbon-free electricity generation to meet the targets that John and Eric and Jenny have been talking about. In 2020, our electricity in the US came from about 60% fossil fuel sources, 20% nuclear, and 20% renewables. And wind was 8 some, solar 2 some, maybe +1 for rooftop solar, and hydro 7%, and biomass and geothermal just under 2% of all of that. This figure we're looking at is from that solar future study that came out in the last week or so. NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab where I work, investigates these massive advances that we need to get to in renewable energy, either holistically across technologies or in specific technologies. And this report looked at getting up to 40% solar, 40% of our electricity from solar by 2035 and 45% by 2050. Is it possible? Yes. Is it easy? Probably not. So we need huge accelerations in transmission, so power line deployment. We need to integrate different energy technologies like storage and that demand response I mentioned. And then we need better transparency into what is happening in the system so that we can deploy these technologies faster and we can manage them better. And there is policy support that's under consideration right now that can help accelerate that. Relevant to us locally, EPS is planning to add 8,000 to 12,000 megawatts of new renewables by 2035. So to put that in perspective, right now their summer peak is under 8,000 megawatts. So that's an awful lot of renewables. We're also likely to see more storage sooner in the Southwest than in other parts of the US because of the value that it offers, because of the way that renewables and our electric load are actually mismatched here. Let's see, the next slide. The last point I wanted to make is that the grid is evolving from fewer larger power plants to a much more distributed system of generating capacity, other technologies, and more participation. Companies, cities, institutions like NAU and homeowners can help utilities to reach decarbonization faster. Frankly, I think we're at the point where anybody putting rooftop solar on their house is actually helping the system. There's a lot of other things that we can do. And we don't necessarily need to be active participants. There's a lot of set it and forget it type things that we can do, like smart thermostats, water heaters, and EV charging. And I'm happy to talk about some of that more. Our electricity rates are going to continue to change. If you think about rates, it's the way that utilities tell us how we can help them to keep the system balanced. And so there are a lot of programs that are specifically designed to get us to move our usage around. And right now, moving our usage around is actually not just an economic tool for our utilities. Those drivers are also pushing them to fewer emissions and decarbonization. Other technology options include electric vehicle charging. You've probably all seen commercials for the new Ford F-150 Lightning. And there's a lot of other things going on in the vehicle technology and charging space that can help with decarbonization. And that means help us bring on more renewables and balance that system. And then big customers can also help utilities with their decarbonization. There's a couple different programs going on locally, and there's a lot of interest in hydrogen, fast microgrids, and even just changes in things like standalone generators. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about any of those technologies, and just wanted to finish up with that point. And I will pass things on to Jenny. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karin. And I should have kind of introduced before, this is really where we're trying to talk about solutions. So Karin knows so much about the electric grid, right? And what those solutions are from the energy sector. I'm going to be speaking about the City of Flagstaff, and just from our point of view and how we think about carbon neutrality and how we're going to get there. Karin's point about possible but not easy, I think is a really, really good theme to think about. The basics from the City of Flagstaff's perspective are our council declared a climate emergency about 1.5 years ago now. This was in response to a couple hundred people coming to them and saying, we are in a climate emergency and we need to act like it, and we need to make our goals a lot more aggressive. Just in June of this past year, they passed their carbon neutrality plan that follows up with that emergency declaration and says we're going to get to carbon neutrality by 2030, and this is how we're going to do it. We have sort of 4 main areas. We need to think about our neighborhoods, our energy sources, our consumption, and our commitment. That's everything, right? That is, I think John said it really well, and then Eric really well, of, the stakes are really high, and we need to think about every single sector of our economy and of our community. So this is the plan over here on the left, and it shouldn't say draft, it should say final in June 2021. But I'm going to talk about kind of the what we're going to do, but I want to kind of just talk first, because this should be, I think, remembered for the rest of the presentation is, we have choices in our approach, right? There's really just generally one way to get to carbon neutrality, right? Again, it's possible, but it's going to be difficult. And that, I think, is just really important to remember. We're going to need to change so many things. But what we have a lot of choice in is we have a lot of choice in how we act. So the city wants to be, have our work rooted in community, right? Our work is motivated by urgency, as John talked about. It is prescriptive, though. It's generally, we kind of know what we have to do to get there. But we want to be accountable. We're making this investment. And this is really supported by market leaders. Flagstaff is going to do a whole lot of things, but really this is about leadership, and it's about kind of our whole community and all of our sectors changing to get to this really ambitious goal, but it's also a really necessary goal. And one really important thing here is equity, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But as we act, we need to think about an equitable community. We want to think about the community that we want to have, right? If we're making all of these changes, how do we think about the community that we want to have throughout all of these changes? How do we think about our most vulnerable community members? So I'm going to get into these sort of 4 big areas. The first is strong neighborhoods. I know there's a ton of words on this slide. I apologize for that, but there's a lot here. The first is equitable systems. So how do we think about the just distribution of the benefits of climate action? If we're making all of these changes, how do we help everyone to get involved and benefit from those changes? How do we also thinking about the burdens of climate change and reducing those burdens, particularly for our vulnerable community members who may not be able to adapt to climate change, right? They may be living sort of paycheck to paycheck, and when you're living in that way, it's a lot harder to adapt to hotter temperatures, right, or unhealthy air. So how do we think about those vulnerable communities and really proactively engage them? Then with resilience, we just want a stronger community, right? We want a community that can thrive, both in short-term shocks. So short-term shocks are, like a weather event, right, that causes flooding, or a fire, right, that causes evacuation, or a fire that causes flooding. Long-term changes are maybe increasing housing prices, right, as Phoenix gets hotter and more people want to come here. How do we think about both those short-term events as well as those long-term changes and supporting our community members in that? And then decreasing dependence on cars. We live in a car-dependent community, right? How can we live in a less car-dependent community? We know that not only do we need to electrify our vehicles, but we also need to just stop driving so much. And so how can we help people walk and bike and take the bus? Because at the end of the day, people are a lot happier. We have a lot better neighborhoods. We have better connections when we live in places that support us walking and biking and busing, right? And getting to know our neighbors, et cetera. This will involve changes to our neighborhoods, things like increasing density, welcoming more neighbors into our communities and into our existing neighborhoods. The next is clean energy sources. In terms of electric mobility, we need to electrify our buses. We need to welcome electric micromobility devices. You probably have a 10-year-old in your neighborhood who has a scooter. Turns out that scooter is really fantastic, low carbon, affordable transportation. How do we think more about those devices? And then supporting our residents in the transition to electric vehicles. We also want to think about renewable electricity production, as Karin talked about, and then shifting our building fuels, so away from fossil fuels, so away from natural gas and propane, and shifting to using electricity. Finally, consumption. We just need to use less energy in our homes, in our existing buildings, in new buildings, old buildings, et cetera. And we need to consume more sustainably. We need to reuse. We need to reduce food waste and feed hungry people, et cetera. We can do a lot better and create a lot less waste within our systems. Finally, this is carbon dioxide removal. This is the other side of a scale of we're still going to have emissions. And so at the end of the day, when we get to carbon neutrality, we're only going to get there by saying, all right, we've reduced our emissions as much as we possibly can. Now what we want to do is take all the emissions that we still emit, right? There still will be gas and diesel cars on the road in 2030. We need to offset those emissions. We need to balance them out with what we are calling carbon dioxide removal. That actually means taking carbon dioxide out of the air. At the end of the day, carbon neutrality is possible, but only if we embrace some big shifts. So I'm out of time. I'm not going to get into all of these, but our neighborhoods need to look different. Our homes need to look different. How we take care of our vulnerable community members all needs to look different. So I'm now going to pass it back to Eric.
Thank you, Jenny. And yeah, these solutions, clearly what the city has to grapple with in terms of the number of stakeholders, the sort of the broader economy-wide actions versus NAU's plan and its actions, where we have a lot more control over, the buildings, our energy systems on campus. And clearly NAU wants to align our climate action plan with the city's goals. And over the next few weeks and months, we will be publishing our sort of roadmap to carbon neutrality for NAU. And I want to just give you some highlights of both sort of the challenge and really the exciting, I think, opportunities for NAU to be a leader in this space. So Jenny, next slide. So just to give a sense of where our emissions are coming from, primarily from purchased electricity, but also the use of, so that's from APS, and using natural gas for our on-site heating and cooling, as well as our university-owned fleet. So these are the things that are sort of directly in our control. Our scope 3 emissions, we're probably looking at another 12 to 18,000 metric tons in terms of the emissions from our commuters, looking at our university air travel. And those are things that we also need to get a handle on that are a little more challenging perhaps than some of these ones that are directly under our control on campus. Next slide. And so our strategies in both the development and thinking about alternatives within our climate action plan, our engagement across the university and thinking deeply about resiliency. How is NAU going to be resilient 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and really engaging a wide array of stakeholders in that discussion. And then a real focus on how can we reduce our energy load, basically from an energy efficiency perspective, but also from a behavioral conservation perspective. Programs on campus that we have had for a long time, like the Energy Mentors program, to get new students, faculty and staff using energy in a way that is beneficial to the campus and to our bottom line budget. but then also making investments in efficiency upgrades in our buildings, in our building retrofits, in our technologies for our energy management in our buildings. And a big piece of that is very attractive for the university is that those types of investments actually save money and pay for themselves quickly, much like they do in individual residential households or for other businesses. And then think about developing policies. So putting a price on carbon, that pollution actually affects society. We shouldn't be externalizing that cost to the world, and therefore we need to include it in our decision making. Potentially a tax on things like parking permits on campus for the carbon associated with that commuting, thinking about how we make purchases that take into account efficiency and the emissions associated with that, so that we can really shift. We're a big purchaser, we can really shift where our priorities are going in terms of low or zero emissions. And then in the end, we need to substitute for the things that are using fossil fuels. So next slide. And the two alternatives we're looking at are fundamentally using biomass rather than natural gas, or a geothermal heat pump. There's a rig set up on South Campus right now that are drilling down 800 feet, maybe up down to 1,000 feet, looking at the heat transfer potential in our rocks for a geothermal heat pump for the entire campus. And just if you look at the economics, the important thing on this figure is just that both biomass and geothermal heat pumps are basically, this is the net present cost for these systems, would be cheaper than keeping our current natural gas system. And the green at the top here are the scope 1 and scope 2 costs of carbon. So we're basically including the damages from our carbon emissions in how we make this decision. That really makes natural gas look like a bad decision. Next slide. And then finally, just I think it's important as we're thinking about policies and the change that we need that's pretty radical. If we think whatever you'll do will be insignificant, and Jenny, if you want to just click through this little figure, but if we make actions, whether that's riding our bike rather than driving, and people say the 101 things you can do to save the environment, the reality is that those are not going to add up to really taking on the scope of decarbonization that we need. That's not going to work. It is insignificant in those ways. The virtuous things, maybe putting solar on my house, they're important. But the next slide, I think, puts it into a bigger structural shift that we need. And so it's not just the individual actions that then give us the opportunity for new social norms, for the breadth of what seems possible. So if you imagine, the streets of Flagstaff full of people on bicycles, that would change the norm in our society where we could actually decarbonize our transportation sector. But we also need to create the infrastructure and the policy will to be able to do that. Hopefully NAU can be that, where we can encourage individual actions, but also develop structure and infrastructure to help reduce emissions for our community and our state. Next slide.
All right. Can everybody hear me all right? Hopefully so. My name is Josh. I am the Citizens Climate Lobby Flagstaff Group co-leader. I'm going to talk about more of the national level carbon pricing solution in order to slow climate change. Go ahead to the next slide, Jenny. So what is a carbon price? Basically, carbon price is a mechanism to price the negative externalities on burning fossil fuels and emitting carbon dioxide or carbon-based emissions. Basically what that means, if you think about somebody who smokes cigarettes, for example, they are putting their own health at risk, but they also are adding to the social cost of that through secondhand smoke, through higher insurance premiums, through just burdening our healthcare system in general. So we put a tax on cigarettes in order to dissuade people from smoking cigarettes, and it actually reflects that cost a little bit more accurately. So that's the same idea behind a carbon price. The carbon price basically says fossil fuels are cheap to burn, but there are these environmental and social costs that are not taken into account with burning those fossil fuels. So we add a price on top of it to bring that price closer to what it actually is, what the actual social cost of it is. Some common implementations of this are a cap and trade program, like something they have in California, just a normal carbon tax, which would just be something pretty equivalent to like the tax on gasoline, but it would probably be something higher, or a carbon fee and dividend program. Go ahead, Jenny. So how it works, it essentially utilizes the market to drive down carbon emissions. Like I said, it brings that fossil fuel or dirty energy cost higher, so that companies look at that and they say, now that it costs us 2x times to run our furnaces, we're going to invest in better low carbon options in order to save that money, because over the long run, it's going to save them significant amounts of money to not have to pay that carbon fee. So companies are incentivized to switch to greener options. On top of that, people are incentivized to switch to greener options because it costs them more money to drive their car. So they're more likely to bike, or if they're able, they're more likely to buy an electric car or whatever it is. And then on top of that, as those things are happening, kind of like what Eric was just saying, it kind of changes the social norms. Companies see that we're not buying gas-powered cars as much, we're riding our bikes more, so our social norms start to switch, and companies innovate, develop cleaner options, and we get better low carbon options for replacing those carbon heavy options. Go ahead, Jane. So carbon price is an equitable solution. It moves the price or the cost of climate change from the lower socioeconomic classes to the larger polluters, because currently 100% or 100 corporations are responsible for 70% of emissions. And so if you can take those companies and say it's going to cost you more to continue to pollute at the rate that you are, and then in some models you end up taking that money and giving it back to the lower income Americans, so that they don't end up spending more money on carbon-based fuels and such while they have to. So you essentially say, high polluters, you're going to take on the burden of climate change and shift some of that responsibility from the people who can't afford it to the people who can. It's effective. It can account for up to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. And it'll save up to 4.5 million, or could save up to 4.5 million American lives in 50 years. That's essentially just because pollution accounts for somewhere between 100,000 to 300,000 deaths a year, and pricing carbon drives pollution down and saves lives. Jen, do I have another slide? Okay, there's one thing I wanted to add. Carbon price is definitely a good piece of a solution, but it definitely can't be the only solution. The things that Jenny is talking about as far as the local solutions, and Eric was talking about at NAU, those are all pieces of the puzzle. And if we decided to put a carbon price in place tomorrow, that would be great, but it's not going to do exactly what we need it to do. It's going to do a piece of what we need it to do. For example, if we have a carbon price of $50 per ton, there might not be super easy transitions to people to replace that. So electric cars aren't cheap enough or whatever. So we need policies that enable the transition as well as price carbon. That's all I got.
Holy cow, that was a lot of stuff. You guys are amazing. Thank you. I think you're kind of blowing the people away too. There's not a lot of questions yet in the chat. So I would just encourage all of you out there who do have something you want to ask about. There was a lot put out on the table. And I think it might be nice to just, there's one technical question for the City of Flagstaff, but I guess at first I maybe want to start a little bigger and just ask, and this might be a question we want to do later too, with so many yeses on the table, some possibilities that we heard little glimpses of. Somebody want to just raise your hand and go, what in your opinion gets us the farthest towards where we need to be? I think we heard a little something from Josh about a carbon price gets us part of the way. What are the big players here? You you can each go. It looks like Josh.
Well, Sean, I was actually going to answer Roger's question, so I will put my hand down and do that later.
Okay.
I would argue that the carbon price is a huge piece of the answer. I think that when I see what's happening with the different policies and all of the complex or convoluted changes we're trying to make to tax policies and incentives and the other things we're trying to do to level the playing field for different types of electricity generation or different kinds of solutions, penalizing something that we don't want enables us to get really creative about how to reduce that thing that we don't want and to get the things that we do want out of it. Echoing Jenny's point earlier, when someone, this isn't what Jenny said, when someone has to drive their children around Flagstaff to get to a daycare that's 8 miles away to come back to right next to where they started to go to work, that's inefficient and doesn't get anybody what they want, least of everybody, the child in the car seat, but also the emissions. And so I think we need to think about what we're trying to get. And by doing things like the carbon price, it forces a lot of different levers in society and helps us get where we want to be without having to find complex and convoluted ways to get there.
Looks like Eric, do you want to add to that? Oh, you're muted, Eric. Dang.
When I was talking about the importance of individual actions, Josh is obviously part of a political, and Sean as well, trying to promote this idea of carbon price on carbon, which internally at NAU we recognize is critical to help us in our decision making space. However, we also know that nationally, politically, taxes are tough, and no matter how it's framed, it's going to be seen as a tax. And I just think it's right now, we're looking at this huge infrastructure bill, and the huge infrastructure bill has sort of tried to route away from thinking about a carbon tax or a price on carbon, and really just think about, let's subsidize all the things that we know we want to get, right? And so we're going to spend government money to get what we want as a more palatable thing. But politically, that still needs to have popular political support, just like a price on carbon would need. And I think that's where, these individual actions and advocacy and social change are absolutely critical to take on the magnitude. It's not as if even NAU is just going to slam dunk this thing with no controversy, or even the city of Flagstaff, where there's a lot of popular support, but some of these hard choices are not popular and they're not well understood. And that's a big challenge, I think, at every scale of action. So I'll leave it there.
Okay.
I have something to add if I could.
Yeah, I was going to say you might be able to talk to Roger right now.
Yeah, I was going to say, exactly. Building the political will is kind of what Roger was speaking to. And yeah, my comment would just be, call your representative, send him an email, send him a letter, reach out to Joe Biden if you want to, and encourage them to include a carbon price in the reconciliation or in the infrastructure bill, because they literally, how it works is they have a tally of people who are calling them about climate change, or people who are calling about a carbon price or whatever, and they'll report that to the senator or to the House or the representative at the end of the day. So the more calls they get about a carbon price or about climate change in general, the more willing they're going to be to get the ball moving.
So Jenny, sounds like you're next. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of back up all of this. I think that, it's a lot easier for us to make decisions as a City of Flagstaff municipality, right? Or it's a lot easier for your elected officials to make decisions, right? When the pricing is on their side and when the economics are on their side. And the reason that we've gotten where we are today is because it's not, right? The pricing does not account for the disaster of climate change that we are already starting to see, right? And so I just want to, we get asked that questions a lot, and you could say, transportation or whatever, but at the end of the day, it's about decisions that we make and having the, backing of the economics behind that, which often really also means the politics behind it. So I just want to kind of echo what everybody's saying here.
Cool. We've got a good pile up of questions too for you, Jenny, too. There's one that's been waiting for a little bit. What CDR methods are you prioritizing in the next 10 years and how are those decisions made? And are there any regionally specific CDR options?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jennifer. And just to clarify for everybody, CDR, when we say CDR, we mean carbon dioxide removal. Carbon dioxide removal is a little bit controversial, right? There are a lot of people who say, stop talking about that. You should only talk about reducing your emissions instead of this sort of get out of jail free card. And what we are seeing is that we are kind of at the stage where we're just not going to be able to reduce emissions as quickly as we need to. And that is still with full system change, full kind of economy change, right? Full change of our community. That's still not going to be enough. So we still need that carbon dioxide removal. Jennifer, the answer is that we're working on it. We don't know exactly. This is a very, very new field. It's a field where we don't know, no one has shown that the technology works on a really, really wide scale. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of innovation across the country and across the world. We hope in the next 9 years on this. What we want to do though is prioritize regional methods. We want to prioritize what can the Colorado Plateau offer in terms of carbon dioxide removal, right? How could we potentially partner with the tribes, right? Could we do it? You can do carbon dioxide removal through regenerative farming. There have been some good experiments in California about that. How can we do that, right? And because that has a lot of other benefits as opposed to just these big machines that maybe pull out, carbon dioxide from the air, right? But can we think about regenerative farming? Can we think about our forests? Our forests generally have too much carbon right now, but are there areas where we can do tree planting, right? That would pull out carbon dioxide removal or carbon dioxide. I'd welcome anyone else if you want to add to that. But this is definitely a work in progress. We don't know quite yet, but we are working on it. Most important to us though is regional partnerships and having regional benefits.
Any other thoughts on that one? CDR is a little bit speculative at this point and lots of questions.
I would just say that, I think regionally, to Jenny's point about our forests, that, some of the analysis that's been done at NAU, looking at the trade-off between the fires that we know are going to happen at the intensity that they're going to happen with a warming climate, that restoring the forests and allowing them to be more resilient can earn us, an additional 60 tons per acre stored in those forests over the next 50, 60 years. So it's sort of a long-term investment, but it's the kind of thing for us to really think about our forests as a natural climate solution and to make the appropriate investments in that restoration. It's absolutely essential.
Cool, thank you. Looks like we're going to move to Sybil's question. How can NAU faculty, CCC faculty, or K through 12 teachers participate in climate change discussions with the City of Flagstaff, especially in terms of getting students involved at all levels of the conversation?
Oh, this is a great question. I'm going to start to answer it. Jillian, feel free to jump in because Jillian, our question answer, actually works directly on this. We are really excited about it. So we are right now working with a couple NAU classes. If there's anybody at NAU, they can reach out to us. We had 9 summer interns this last summer working on climate solutions. In terms of K-12 teachers, we work with Willow Bend to do climate change curriculum in schools. We also have a youth climate challenge that any classroom can do that says, tell us your climate action, right? Tell us about your climate action. And we bring all the students who work on those projects, and I think it's 4th through 12th grade, to present in the spring to each other and get their projects judged. And so we are bringing that back this year. We didn't have it last year, but we're really excited to talk with anybody. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email maybe in a question so everybody can see it. I'll figure out how to do that. But we're really excited about it. I'd welcome anybody else on here to talk about collaborations as well, because it's the name of the game, right? We need every single person in the city of Flagstaff or in the community of Flagstaff to be working on this. And so we know that our students have really great solutions.
And I would just add from an NAU perspective that our hope is accompanying this climate action plan will also be what we're calling a sustainable campus ecosystem initiative, which will invite faculty and staff to, treat our region and our campus as a laboratory for experimentation, innovation, and our new president, Cruz Rivera, we're really excited that he has welcomed both the Climate Action Plan as well as this, engagement with faculty, staff, and students in solving problems as absolutely essential. And but again, it's going to have to be weighed against the other university priorities. And so if people want to communicate with the president that they think this is an important priority, I would encourage you to do that.
Julian, did you want to put a word in, or you good?
I think Jenny really covered that one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I guess we'll move into the technical question about the 100, 300, 500-year flood events all summer. We've been hearing about realizing they're based on percentages, so and so on. Is it time to recalibrate, or are these numbers still useful? Maybe that's a question for John.
Yeah, I mean, yes, right. So they are based on statistics, historical trends. And so, I think that's actually a really great point. Is moving forward, we are likely to see those numbers updated and put into a new perspective. There's actually a slide I had in the presentation that talked exactly about that, and how depending on how many degrees of warming we actually see, it increases those 100, 500-year events much quicker. So yeah, I mean, really, I'm not sure how else to answer that other than to say, yes, we need to update those trends. So.
Cool. Thanks for that. I'm going to sort of make a little exception here. And Karin, you teased us with a couple of things that I think it would be great to hear more about. You were talking about things that work in the background that are kind of standalone: water heaters, EV charging, smart thermostats, things like that. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually I wanted to make one more tiny comment about Don's question. The other half of her question was, could you even say 500 is the new 300, or right? Or when you're thinking about flooding, or can you not say because it's so uncertain? And this is not my area of expertise, but I suspect you're less and less able to say, right? You would need so much data. By the time you had that data, could say with any certainty, we'll all be underwater, we'll be dealing with the solution, right? So, but to get to Sean's question, there are a number of, broadly speaking, the electrical system, as I mentioned, has to stay balanced at all times. And so if you have, whether it's across the entire West or within a balancing area or within just the Northern Arizona region, if you bring on large amounts of variable, so wind or solar generation, you have to have other technologies in place to be able to balance out the system. And one of the ways that utilities are able to do so more than they ever were before is by engaging with all of us and our electricity using appliances, cars, et cetera, as what you might call a virtual power plant. And so either in the instance of having something like large battery storage in one place, or having 10,000 people with electric vehicles, you can use all of those different energy storage technologies, or the ability to change people's electricity usage in the same way on the electrical system that you previously or historically used something like a fast cycling natural gas fired power plant. And so to give a concrete example, I actually called up a colleague who works in technology innovation at APS to ask him for examples that I could talk about in being able to present on this. And he mentioned that their, I think it's called Cool Rewards program enables people to let the utility change the temperature in their house. And obviously this is based on cooling, so it's largely used in Southern Arizona, but this is something that they could potentially retool so it would also work for electric heating or water heating and maybe more relevant to people in Flagstaff and in the cooler parts of the state. But they've discovered that when you allow them to change your thermostat, so you pre-cool your house, then let it ride at the temperature you want it at in the late afternoon, and then let it get 2 degrees warmer than you want it to in the 6 to 8 p.m. period. He told me, I think it was the change available there is like 1.5 kilowatts per customer. And they have something like, I don't know which Word document I have it in front of me, but it's like 50,000 customers enrolled in this program. And so that is equivalent to a natural gas fired peaking unit. And so, and they have 1 million residential customers. So by all of us saying, how can we help? Either as individuals, as institutions, as businesses, we could potentially be making a lot of difference with those devices that enables them to function and to bring on more renewables that is actually a more operational solution than us perhaps putting renewables on the roof or even getting a more efficient something or other.
And is that a program that, rather than calling up APS and say, how can I help? Is that a thing that each of us can sign up for? Sorry if I missed that part.
No, and I'm glad you didn't miss it. I'm glad you mentioned that. They actually, instead of making you go get your Nest thermostat or your whatever, or et cetera, and then call them and sort it out, they actually have their own. Now I sound like a salesperson for APS. They have their own like their own marketplace where you can buy the devices. It gets all set up automatically. You can get on the right rate and they'll help you get things coordinated. So there, it's like aps.marketplace or marketplace.aps or something like that, but they have their own site. And a lot of the time, because of the incentives that the state or they have available or incentives that come through like Google, you can get all the devices for free. And then you just sign up for the program. And that one I was mentioning is about it's about cooling, but they could be encouraged to develop something about heating or water heating. And they have other programs with electric vehicle charging, and they're developing a lot of other technology pilots that really are us helping them to balance the system, and us helping them do that is helping them to decarbonize faster.
Awesome. Thank you. Eric.
I just want to add, I think it's really important for folks to know, APS can make some of these changes on their own, right? To have both sides of both the production and consumption working together. But a lot of that is driven by what the Corporation Commission allows. And so again, this is another political question. What does the Corporation Commission want in terms of decarbonizing Arizona's grid? And, regardless of the incentives that are provided by the Biden administration, the rules are set at the state level for our utilities. And so for people to be tuned in to the election, both of those corporation commissioners, but also the policy evolution that's happening down in Phoenix is quite important to guide, encourage, help the utilities, help us reach these climate goals.
Amen.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And that's hard for us to remember sometimes when we're voting. So thanks for that. We've got a question pending. Most impactful changes that have been put into motion in Flagstaff, specifically since the carbon neutrality plan was put into action. So that can be a Jenny and that can be an anybody following up.
Yeah, I will. I'll start. I will tell you, not a ton. Council, we passed it 3 months ago. Council was on break for about 2 of those months. So, but at the same time, this is a very big ship to turn, right? Our community, right? How our community changes. So it's gonna kind of be, sometimes we talk about piranha bites, right? Like a lot of little things, things that will be really big that we are working on right now. The Active Transportation Master Plan. It's a plan that was just published last week, and it's about how do we transform our community's transportation to prioritize active transportation. That means, maybe when we think about our road space, maybe we add more space for biking and walking, and maybe a different lane for scooters, right? And that might mean taking away room for cars, right? That might mean dealing with a little bit more congestion because we want this other kind of transportation to move forward. So I'll put in the chat a link to that plan so y'all can get involved. It's in its 60-day review right now, but that is an incredibly impactful document and really needs a lot of public support to make sure that we can make those changes. Another thing we're working on is the housing plan. The City of Flagstaff is working on a 10-year housing plan right now to talk about how much housing we need to solve our housing emergency. Housing is incredibly tied to climate change. I tell folks the number one thing I'm worried about with climate change. I'm worried about, really major forest fires and drought and what those things mean. we talk a lot about that and we know how to solve that. I'm probably more worried about what happens to Flagstaff when more and more folks come up from Phoenix, because Phoenix is going to have more and more days over 120 days or degrees, right, every summer, and more extreme heat than they already do. And so what does that look like for our vulnerable community members? How does our community shift and change? A big part of that is going to be thinking about housing. I talked a little bit about housing as part of the carbon neutrality plan, but that's one of the things where we need very big change, but it's going to be this sort of slow ship to turn. My neighborhood is a single family residential neighborhood. I have a really nice bike commute to town. Can my neighborhood change to allow duplexes and more backyard homes and maybe small apartment buildings and maybe small corner stores? How can my neighborhood change so that we can allow more people to come in there? And that would allow more people to take advantage of my really nice bike commute downtown, as well as, you know, my really good schools that I live near, right? So how can we think about that? And think about those kind of hard changes, right? And those two plans are very, very big. They're not technically climate actions, but they are incredibly important. So I'll send links to both of those plans. And as they're going, the housing plan draft hasn't come out yet, but it will be very soon. We've been working with our housing folks on that. So those are very big things, housing and transportation, but those are probably two of the most impactful things that we've been working on this summer since the carbon neutrality plan has passed.
Anybody else have anything you want to add to good news and out of Flagstaff on the climate change front?
I just will make one note that for NAU in particular, when I talked about, you know, once we've reduced our total energy use, then thinking about how do we substitute with renewable or non-carbon emitting energy sources. A big obstacle to, you know, homeowners, to businesses, is the upfront cost of doing any of this, right? And what I think is actually quite exciting is sort of innovation in finance and innovation in how do we pay for these things? And, you know, things like tax credits are great, but you have to pay taxes to be able to get a tax credit on your federal tax bill. So there's talk in DC about some of these federal tax credits and changing the way that they function. And for, you know, NAU, cash flow is going to be a big issue for us to make, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. And what I find exciting is that it looks like there's multiple avenues for that to happen, where we can maintain our cash flow and we don't have to go out and take on huge debt, and you know, think outside the box, because we can't just do it asking the state legislature to give us the money to do this. That's not a solution for us.
Well, thanks, Eric. Josh?
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, the bill that Citizens Climate Lobby specifically endorses is HR 2307, and it's the Energy Innovation Carbon Fee and Dividend. And essentially, the idea goes to exactly what Eric was saying, is how can you afford these upfront costs of replacing with or going to cleaner energy? So the carbon fee and dividend, essentially, you pay the fee, and then depending on the bill, it's either a monthly or an annual check. And that check, for most families, most middle class and lower income families end up making money on the dividend. And that could essentially be used to transition to cleaner energies. So you could have, if you want to reinvest your dividend into cleaner energies, then you are saving money on your dividend, and then next year you even have more to invest in a future clean energy replacement.
Cool, thanks. We're getting a little bit behind on questions, so let me just march ahead here. We've got a slide on the cost of disasters for climate change. Is there one specifically for Flagstaff? And who's paying to cover these disasters? Will climate change affect the rules for funding disasters? That's a big question.
Yeah, I did make a comment that those particular cost spots came from the National Climate Assessment, and they do have regional cost estimates, but I think there might be some more specific numbers for Flagstaff in the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan, but I can't remember exactly. I don't know if any of the city folks want to comment on that, but I think we have some estimates for climate damages in Flagstaff somewhere.
I don't remember
Maybe.
specifically. It's going to cost a lot. We know climate change is going to cost a lot, and we are all going to pay for it. Whether that's through local taxes or personal property or federal taxes, right? That's it. It will cost our entire community lots. So I don't have those
Yeah.
specific numbers. Sorry.
I mean, I certainly predict there's going to be some sort of fundamental shift in how federal response in paying for these damages. I think it's going to change. I mean, right now it's FEMA is overloaded and there's declarations being made for disasters. It seems like every week, and I just feel like it's not sustainable. Like there's going to have to be some maybe new division of the federal government associated with the climate change impact recovery or something. I don't know, but I think it's yeah, we're not gonna be able to keep up with all of the costs associated with it unless we start factoring it into major budgets and things like that at the federal level, for sure.
I appreciate that. Josh, you still have your hands up, and then I want to ask people in the audience. I can't see hands going up, so if you could type your questions, that would be super helpful. Okay, Josh.
Sean, I had something to add. I know that just at a national level, extreme weather and disasters cost the U.S. $99 billion last year. I do also know that the infrastructure bill, that is the bipartisan bill, the $1 trillion bill, has funding for agriculture, like recovery from extreme weather and stuff like that, and climate adaptation for agriculture. But I don't believe it has anything else as far as like paying for emergency. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. There's one more. What cities in the U.S. or globally are good examples of? I'm not sure what this means. Reducing community decisions. Maybe making good community decisions on climate. I don't know if anybody has.
I bet it's supposed to be reducing community emissions.
Emissions. Okay.
It says decisions.
There we go. She clarifies has to answer. Oh no, John.
There's certainly the big players. I mean, New York City has an incredible climate action plan that has some really strong goals. San Francisco, Portland, some of the major cities. Internationally, there's huge efforts in like Melbourne, Australia, London, and the big players there as well. But from a smaller perspective, like smaller cities, I don't know if I have a good example right now of one that would be sort of Flagstaff equivalent. I'll have to.
Jenny, didn't the city map a bunch of different other cities and their climate action plans in the process of building our own? Did you discover any leaders?
Yeah, so we use Ann Arbor, for example, just passed a sort of zero emissions plan with exactly how they're going to pay for it, right? We don't have that, full detail, right? But how they're going to get there, how they're going to think about solar, right, in their community and getting there and purchasing and things like that. We do kind of look throughout. Portland is really interesting from a transportation perspective, which is apparently where my mind is today, or always. But, they used to be a fairly car-oriented city, and they have made this transformation through really deliberate choices about what they fund in terms of their transportation system. There are, cities in California that have said every building we build now needs to be net zero energy. So they are already there. There are a lot of other cities that have started to do these things and to sort of walk the walk there. It's kind of about learning from different places.
Well, we're about ready to transition. I'm just going to open it up to the panelists. If you have something to say that you haven't gotten to say yet that you think is important for everybody, I would say now's your chance.
I'll jump in. I think just to jump on or piggyback on that last point, as cities, specifically with respect to electricity, because that's my area, are thinking about decarbonization. I think the city of Flagstaff has done a good job with this, but going to whoever is providing electricity and saying, how do we work together? What can we do? What can we as an institution or organization do? What can our citizens and businesses do to get you there faster is, to me, really important and can be a lot more impactful than some of the specific things that we might think that we should be doing.
Another quick comment I think I would just make is people like to look at data and they like to see changes happening. I know it sounds silly, but Like if you have solar panels on your house, you like to see kind of what you're doing every day and actually get a sense of like the progress that you're making. So I think one of the most effective things that cities are doing where it's working well is they're making their dashboards publicly available of here are the actual reductions that are happening. And so any citizen can log in and say, oh, this is what's happening here. And this is how much is changing here. In a sense, it almost gamifies things because you can say, oh, if I drive a little more on my electric car, I've reduced this. And so I think that that is a really effective tool as opposed to just being like, oh, my city is doing some kind of nebulous stuff in the background to try and reduce emissions. To be able to just log in and actually see things changing and reducing, I think that'll end up being a really popular trend that you start seeing happening in a lot of cities and a lot of communities.
Cool. I think Jenny might be the natural follow-up, and then Josh right after. Okay.
Sure. I agree, John. That's it's such a great kind of public participation transparency thing. I just want to say, I know I talked a lot about a big change. What we know is that climate action makes life better, right? In so many ways, right? When we switch from natural gas to electricity in our homes, the indoor air quality benefits are incredible, right? When we have connected transportation systems, people have a lot more fun, right? Just getting to work, right? When we have more thriving neighborhoods, people know their neighbors, right? And so there's been so much here and so many good ideas, but at the end of the day, we know that there's so many co-benefits to all of these things. It's just about having the sort of decision frameworks in place that help us get there.
Thanks, Jenny. Josh, and then Eric.
Okay, cool. I will be really quick because so we can get to Eric. But here's what this is what I want to say. Just make sure you call your Congress member. Their phone number is right there. And that'll just take you to the person that answers the phone, and you tell them who your Congress member is and tell them that you want a carbon price, you want them to do something about climate change. It's an easy way to stay motivated. And if you call on the weekends, you don't even have to talk to anybody. You just leave a voicemail. So.
Bravo. Eric, you want to take this home then? You can do the follow-up.
I think, starting with John and thinking about the urgency of the situation, the city's, emergency declaration, we have to act now. The imperative is here. And to me, what gives me great hope is one, what's happening with the youth and Fridays for the Future and the students that I engage with at NAU, but also to sort of the area of Karin's expertise in terms of the economics. 10, 15 years ago, we couldn't actually see a pathway with policy and cost to get to the kinds of climate mitigation that we know we need to do. And today, we can actually see that pathway. And the National Renewable Energy Lab has laid out, pathways for the entire economy. How can we decarbonize? How can we electrify everything? And so, the advances in science and technology have really helped us change this discussion. But I'm a policy person, but I do think, it is what we have not conquered is the policy problem. And but the nice thing is everything else is in place. I'll end with that.
You have a couple minutes, Eric, and I've never known you to end short. So we could do that just as a change of pace, or hand it back over to Brandon, whatever you pick. Okay, well, thanks everybody. I really appreciate you all, as I said before, coming out on a Sunday and for the festival to host us. And I'm going to hand it back to Brandon and Sherry and see if they want to direct us to some other cool stuff that's going on. And just thanks again. Really appreciate all of you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone. This has been a great conversation. The festival, we try to share and communicate science, and this is the issue of our time. And you guys taking your time on a Sunday to share technology, share the science, what's been changing. It means a lot. It's like I think we said earlier, it's the small things. It may not be significant, but we still need to do it. So I really want to thank you. This is important work that you do, and I'm thankful for being part of it. This is a event we do every year, looking at to see what's new. Like we say at the Passover table, like next year in Jerusalem, but maybe next year in this case in person, if we can, would be great. It's great to see everyone's face and have conversations together. I have put links in our chat for where you can get tickets for future festival events or other webinars. This is being streamed to YouTube. So if you want to share this later, easily can. The last thing I wanted to kind of just something John had mentioned was how we can gamify this in some way. And I think that's a really astute remark. There's actually, and it's a really nice segue, because the Side Talks this Friday is actually one of the speakers is going to discuss how we can use gaming to improve our education system. So, and considering the amount of time I've spent on my Apple Watch competing with my friend in New York City on calories burned, I totally get it. So again, thank you. Sherry, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, actually, there is one little thing. The festival presents all this amazing content for free every year, 10 free days of the most amazing content out there. And I start to sound like the PBS people. It can't be done without our sponsors and donors. So if you would like to hop on over to scifest.org, there is a donate now button that we would love for you to press. Every little bit counts. We've got major sponsors and we have grants, but we really can't do it without regular people just like you. And thank you very much.
And complete the survey too. Thank you, Sherry.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. You guys have been great. I look forward to doing this again next year.
Appreciate everybody. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.